Mrs. Holroyd. So, for today's lesson, we are going to talk about the beginning of agriculture. If you'd like to follow along, we will be covering pages 24 to 27, which is lesson 1.2 in your social studies book. So, we're going to talk about the ways that farming improved life during this time, which is called the New Stone Age. And at the end of this video, you'll be able to explain how the development of agriculture changed human life and different ways that farmers improved the way that they did work. So, experts believe farming, or another name for farming is agriculture, began about 9,000 years ago, which is 7,000 BC. So at this point, people had really began to settle in villages that were located along rivers and lakes where the soil was very fertile and they were able to farm. Because of this, people no longer had to hunt and gather food, so they didn't have to travel from place to place and follow their food. They were able to stay in one area. But because they still used tools that were predominantly made of stone, we call this time period the New Stone Age. Okay, so during the New Stone Age, farmers began to raise more crops than they could eat. So this extra food is called a surplus. Having this surplus allowed people to do things other than farming. So a little bit before this point, everybody farmed and they would harvest what they farmed, and that would be what was used to feed their family. Now, because of some of the innovations that we'll discuss, people did not have to farm. What they were able to do is specialize, which means that they were able to do one particular job. So, for example, instead of farming, let's just say a family, the man of the house was able to build and create bows and arrows, or they created blankets or clay pots or different tools or baskets. Because they didn't have to farm and they were able to specialize and create these different items that are necessary to live during this time period, it really changed the way that people worked. So because of this, people came to the villages to trade whatever products that they had for the products they needed. There was no money system at this point. It simply was a bartering economy, which means that you just traded. So if you had corn because that you were a farmer and that's what you harvested, or wheat, and you needed baskets or you needed a bow or you needed a clay pot, you would bring the corn that you had to the market and you would trade it for whatever it is that you needed. So in a way, it's similar to like our modern day Walmart, only we use cash and not bartering. But it really was a way for people to get all of the materials or items that they needed without having to do it all themselves. So it's really changed the way of life. So farming gave people a steady diet. They began to live longer. Because of that, the populations grew. Villages became towns. These towns began to trade with each other. And people really now had a way of developing a craft. It was a completely different way of life. In addition to all of this, people began domesticating animals and plants. Now, it's something we don't really think about today, but domestication, what domesticate means is to raise something to be useful to humans. So the early farmers, even prior to 7,000 BC, humans domesticated wild wolves to be what we call like our modern day dog. But at this point, farmers began to domesticate dogs, goats, pigs, cattle, sheep to be useful to them. They also learned, in addition, to domesticate wild plants, which is not something that we typically would say. Nowadays, we typically think of when you domesticate something, it's an animal, but they were able to plant different wild plants and harvest them for their own benefit. So really, that is considered domesticating. Because of this domestication, it caused a revolution, which the definition for that is a great change in how people live or how things are done. So, because of the change in farming during the New Stone Age, people will refer to this time period as the agricultural revolution because of the major change in how people lived due to the change in agriculture. This is just a quick visual of what a town may have looked like. Obviously, there were no photographs or paintings from this time period. We just have different artifacts, but it's an artist rendering of the time period. So, usually, you'd find animals roaming in the wild. People now learned how to maintain them in different areas and feed them to keep them healthy and alive. And they would get different, they would benefit in different ways from domesticating animals. They could milk the cows, they could use their hide for clothing or bedding or meat. There were many, many different ways to use the animals that were domesticated. So below, you'll see the question. Well, first it says domestication was important to humans at this time. So, what did humans gain from domesticating plants and animals? So, what I'd like you to do is give specific examples of ways you think humans benefited from domestication. Please feel free to go back on all of the slides as many times as you need to. You also can, and I encourage you to refer back to your textbook if needed to go over some of the information that was on these past few slides. So you can pause this, take a moment, answer that question, and then return. We have a few more slides to go and another question, and then you're done. Okay. So, in addition to domestication, farmers began to develop these new farming techniques. And because of the area that the ancient people lived, they needed to develop these techniques, adapt to their surroundings in order to successfully farm. So, one way that people developed a technique to work the area was to build what's called a terrace. Now, these terraces are level platforms of earth that climb a hill similar to what a staircase would look like. So, before this, the hills were, you were unable to farm on any hilly area. Once farmers developed this technique, it really multiplied the amount of land that they had to farm. So they would create these little terraces, these spots right here, which don't look large in this picture, but they really are a large area. And they would be able to use it for planting. And they could plant different types of crops on each level if necessary. So that really did change the way that they farmed. One thing that when I look at this picture, I don't know why I always, always, always picture in my mind, here we go, a pound cake that's sliced up. It almost looks like a chocolate pound cake in slices. Um, so your bonus word for this video is the word pound cake. And you'll see underneath, that's you can add that to your Google form for extra homework credit. So I'm sure you can see the similarities, right? Looks like little terraces and pound cake. Now I'm hungry. All right. Another technique that farmers used was the creation of canals in these dry areas. So what these canals did was to bring water to the crops from a main water source. They were able to dig these canals or reservoirs through the land, and it would deliver water to the crops. And we'll talk more in the next few lessons about how this was done and how it actually benefited the farmers. But for now, I simply want you to understand that these were constructed and it was another tool that farmers used to help them. This is the picture that's on one of the first slides, but it really does show a village at this point, and you see that most of the villages had these canals running through them. So that's exactly what the arrow is pointing at. You can also see that there is a farmer who has domesticated animals and is using it to help him plow through his fields. And you really can see that there are these palms were used to create different huts. So there were many ways that animals and plants were used for domestication purposes. Okay. Second method of that farmers used to help them was something that's called slash and burn. It's a method where they would go through these forested areas and cut down some of the greenery and then burn the remaining stumps and branches and twigs that were left. And this in turn cleared the area so that they could use it more for farming. And farmers also began to pay attention to the weather so that it would understand. We at this point we didn't have a calendar the way we have today. So farmers needed years of experience in order to understand the weather and typically when uh, the weather would change. Either the rivers would flood or there would be droughts, but they were able to somewhat predict this type of a climate change, and they adjusted the crops that they grew according to that. In addition to all of those little techniques, farmers also developed different tools to help them harvest. One of the most important was called an adze, which is a kind of axe that was used to clear forests. And we just saw something called a slash and burn. So an adze was used throughout that time. There is also a hoe, which is used for keeping weeds out of gardens, and a sickle that is used for cutting fields of grain. And remember, we talked about this time period being called the New Stone Age. So you can see these were all made of different types of stone, and here are sharp pieces of stone that were adhered to another piece of stone using a different type of sticky material that would adhere both of the stones together. So, the second question that you will answer for homework today is, how did the development of agriculture, including the new tools and techniques that we just discussed, changed? How did that change human life? So, I'd like you to just really thoughtfully answer these two questions and be prepared to discuss them in your groups tomorrow when we come to class. Please submit your homework tonight. You can add that bonus word. If you've watched these videos, you know that bonus word that I discussed a little while ago. So please add that in for some bonus homework points. And tomorrow we'll discuss any questions or comments that you may have about this. Okay, have a great night. I'll see you in the morning.